Joyce and I were with him, he talked to 210 children for an hour and kept their attention. He was amazing. So I hope you had an opportunity to visit his book and DVD sale table. If not, we're pretty informal. You can just get up and do that. I'm not going to take a whole lot of time to talk about the foundation, but there might be some of you who don't know really what we do. So real quickly, we've been around since 2005. We're a nonprofit organization, and in the 12 years that we've been working in this region, our mission stays the same, and that is to supply grants that fund projects in the Grantham, Eastman, Enfield, and Springfield region that will protect our watershed, our woodlands, and our wildlife. Now, we also support environmental education programs, and we maintain our own scholarship program. Every year, we give 2 $1,500 scholarships to local students who are college-bound and who are going to be going into the fields of sustainability or environmental science or related fields. Applications will be out in January, so if anybody knows of a student who lives in Grantham, Enfield, or Springfield, direct them to our website, ecfnh.org, in January. Download the application, fill it out, send it to us. Thank you. The other thing that we believe strongly in is that once we've all worked so hard to commit ourselves to being good stewards to the environment, we've got to go out and play in it. So we also will fund grants for projects that have to do with outdoor recreation and cultural events. And I think that's a pretty good use of our grant money. We are so lucky to have a very engaged and very energetic board of trustees, and I know that many of our trustees are very familiar faces to you, but I want to introduce them to you anyway. So trustees, as I call your name, if you could just stand up for a sec, that'd be great. First is our Vice President, Eva McCart, our Secretary Treasurer, Donna Matson, our Co-Secretary, Jeannie West, our Scholarship Chair, Hetty Fample, Shirley Green, Joe Watts, George Sutherland, who is a founding father of the foundation, and our newest trustee, John Larrabee. It's really too bad nobody knows John. I'm sorry, I'm kidding. I would also like to recognize Sheldon Stokes, who volunteers his time to be our webmaster. Tonight we are videoing, yes. Tonight we are videoing the presentation, and Sheldon's going to help us upload it to our website. Again, it's ecfnh.org. So if you know of anybody who couldn't be here tonight and wanted to be, please let them know that within a couple of days, the video is going to be available to watch. They'll be able to see everything that Ben has to say about theirs. So, I am really proud to announce that in the last 12 years, we have been able to give our local region that we serve, Grantham, Enfield, Eastman, and Springfield, $71,000 in grants and scholarships. Do you know where that money comes from? It comes from donors. It comes from people just like you. Without your generous support, we wouldn't be able to do our work. So we count on folks like you. If you have donated to us in the past, thank you so much. You've helped us so tremendously. And also, we get some help from our local partners. And I'd like to thank Lake Sunapee Bank, as well as the Eastman Family Singers for underwriting this event tonight. Now, I don't know if you had an opportunity to see the very colorful watering can in the back of the room. When you walked in tonight, there was a lot going on. There was, flowers and cookies and coffee, and there's a watering can. We were collecting donations in that can. Thank you if you've had an opportunity to sprinkle a little green in the can so that we can continue our green projects. If you haven't had the opportunity, feel free to do so at any time tonight. Thank you in advance for that. All right, I've talked way too long. I'm going to start introducing and telling you a little bit about tonight's speaker. He is a local boy. He lives just up the road in Lyme, but he's nationally known. He has an undergraduate degree in wildlife biology. He has his PhD in environmental science. He, along with his wife Deborah, who's here tonight, and his sister Phoebe, run the only licensed bear rehabilitation center in the state of New Hampshire. Over the last 2 decades, they have taken in well over 100 orphaned bear cubs and worked with them to see if they could rehabilitate them and reintegrate them back into the wild. And I believe tonight Ben will probably give you some statistics on how successful that's been. He and his work have been featured on National Geographic Channel, the Discovery Channel, ABC's Good Morning America, the Nightly News, NBC's Today Show, and that list goes on and on. He's written 2 books, he's given over 500 lectures, and estimates that he has educated over 60,000 people about black bears and their social behavior. He's been featured in many articles in magazines such as the National Geographic and Field and Stream, People magazine, and he's contributed to those magazines as an author and published articles on bears and the social behavior of bears. So, most recently, he's been involved in the panda reintroduction program in China. So, we are so fortunate to have him in this area, and we are very fortunate to have him in Grantham tonight. Would you please help me welcome Ben Kilham?
I started working with black bears about 25 years ago and came at it from rather an unusual angle. I graduated from the University of New Hampshire in 1974 with a bachelor's degree in wildlife and hope to go on to do the kind of work I'm doing today. But unfortunately I'm dyslexic and my grade scores and test scores were below par and I failed to get into graduate school. As a result, I went west to a trade school and learned the art of gunsmithing and employed myself as a custom gunsmith and gun designer over 30 years. I met my wife Debbie, who's hiding behind the table back there, at Colt Firearms, where we both worked in the product engineering department. And in 1984, we returned to New Hampshire, and I still had it in my mind that I wanted to do the kind of work that I wanted to do. And I had a leg up on this because my father, Lawrence Kilham, who was a virologist at the Dartmouth Medical School, studied birds as an avocation. He wrote the life histories of the woodpeckers in the eastern United States, as well as a book on crows and ravens. So I grew up in a household with lots of wild animals around. When I was 2, my dad went on sabbatical to Africa and brought a half-grown leopard into the house, much to my mother's chagrin. My younger sister Phoebe, who helps me with the bears today, was 1 at the time. My next oldest brother, Josh, was 4. He woke up one night with the leopard at the end of his bed screaming. But needless to say, we all survived and returned from Africa with 2 African hornbills and a Nile crocodile that my dad raised in the basement shower until it was 6 feet long. The National Zoo came and took it away. In 1961, we came to New Hampshire when I was 9 years old. My dad continued his activities with wildlife. He had licenses to keep any bird or native mammal, and so we had all kinds of animals around the house. We had a beaver in the kitchen that leveled the floors and dammed up the toilet. There was a porcupine in the greenhouse next to his study. We had foxes and woodchucks, and he had woodpeckers in aviaries, hawks and owls, crows and ravens. So we had a lot going on. And when my time came along, I was interested in carnivores and carnivore behavior. And carnivores were a lot different to study than birds. My dad prided himself on simple apparatus. He had a small folding chair, a pair of binoculars, and he and my mother would sit in front of woodpecker nests and document courtship and behavior. But I had to come up with a different plan to study carnivores. But based on my childhood experience, I realized I could raise an orphan animal untethered in the forest and document its juvenile behavior and use that to understand its adult behavior. Now, I wasn't thinking about black bears. There was no formal rehabilitation of black bears in most of New England at the time. I was thinking more along the lines of a bobcat or a coyote or perhaps a fisher, the large woodland weasel we have. My sister Phoebe and I became licensed wildlife rehabilitators. I had the hopes of getting a hold of one of those animals to study. Phoebe's interests were with husbandry. And after 2 years, none of those animals came our way. But one day a conservation officer broke departmental policy and brought us an 11-month-old black bear cub that he thought had been hit by an automobile. Turned out it had not been hit by an automobile, it had no infectious disease, yet it had the shakes and wobbles, it couldn't climb or stay on a branch. I was interested in finding out what the cause of this illness was, but the cub was quickly confiscated from me for the lack of a permit. But later that spring, I got a call from the director of Fish and Game, and he asked me if I'd take that bear back. I told him that my interest was in finding out what was wrong with it. Bears can die in the woods and we never learn anything from them, but this was an opportunity to learn something. We ultimately had to euthanize it. We sent the brain out to the Wildlife Disease Lab in Wyoming and got a diagnosis of lysosomal storage disease. The human equivalent of that is Tay-Sachs disease and is caused by inbreeding in the population. This was the first documented case of lysosomal storage disease in black bears. It's very rare in wild animal populations, relatively common in domestic animal populations. After all, that's how we get domestic animals. And since that time, there have been 2 more cases in New Hampshire, 2 in Massachusetts, 1 in Maine, and more recently 1 out in Wyoming. The likely cause of this illness in the population was the fact in the 1850s, 85% of New England was open agricultural land. The forest habitat of the black bear was gone or greatly fragmented, and there was 125 years of bounties on black bears. This led to small island populations where this type of inbreeding might have occurred. Potentially it's a problem because for every cub born with the illness, there's 1 born without it and 2 that are carriers. And anytime 2 carriers mate, the disease arises again. So ultimately we don't know much about the disease or how prevalent it is in the population, except it's still, cubs are still showing up, and by far the majority of cubs are just dying in the woods. Later that spring, I got a call from Forrest Hammond from Vermont Fish and Wildlife. He heard about what my interests were. He had 2 orphan cubs as the result of the Stratton Mountain Bear Study. He interviewed me and asked me if I'd take the 2 cubs, and I said, well, you know, things are pretty sensitive about bear permits, and permits to keep bears. And I said, if you'll talk to New Hampshire and they're willing to grant me a permit, I'll take the 2 cubs. Well, the next morning I had a permit in hand. And since that time, we've raised, rehabilitated, and returned to the wild 165 black bear cubs. We currently have 16 at our facility in Lyme. Our facility is made up of an indoor enclosure with 2 small pens where we bring the cubs in and monitor them until we can assess their condition. And then there's a large indoor cage that's about 24 by 32 feet long and 16 feet high. Cubs go into there. They come in mostly between the middle of May and the first week of July. That batch of cubs are in and have made friends with each other. We open up the door into an 8-acre enclosure. It's a forested enclosure with an oak stand, a wetland, several ponds, and several large pine and skate trees. So the cubs have natural foods. We have to supplement them, of course. The number of cubs that we've been receiving has greatly increased since 2008. And the single biggest reason that we're getting cubs is that mother bears are being shot at unprotected chicken houses. And to protect a chicken house or protect anything, bees or any other livestock from bears, a baited electric fence, that means an electric fence with smell on it that's kept fresh, will keep bears out of anything. Bears check out new smells with their nose or tongue, and once they've been zapped on their nose or tongue, they have very little interest in what's behind the fence. The youngest cubs that, oh, here's our culprit, is a chicken coop. It's often met with an emotional reaction, but the reality is there's no reason for homeowners to be shooting bears anytime they come on their property, even though it's legal in New Hampshire. New Hampshire has a good system working with wildlife services. They have 2 technicians that work full-time, will provide emergency electric fences when there's problems. They'll respond to bear complaints immediately, and they're devoted full-time to addressing bear problems throughout the state. So having to shoot these bears is really unnecessary. The youngest cubs that have come to us in early February. 2 of these were the result of a winter logging operation, which is pretty unavoidable. The other 2, a rabbit hunter chose to shoot the mother bear in the den and then let his dog get after the cubs. One of the cubs had visible wounds, and we were able to treat it, and it survived. The other one had no visible wounds but died after a week, so we assumed that it had internal injuries. My interest in bears has been in the study of their behavior, and this chart you won't be able to read, but you can see it's fairly complex, is how I've assembled the observations I've made over the years. And when I started doing this work, bears were considered to be solitary animals. That is, the only interactions they had with their own kind was thought to be with their cubs and their mates during the mating season, and they knew they congregated at concentrated food sources. But beyond that, they knew very little about them. And what I found is that these bears are actually highly social animals. They're not social like a pack of wolves or a group of chimpanzees that live within fixed territories, that have alpha animals that allocate resources down through family groups. But bears, the female home ranges are as close to territories that exist, and these female home ranges are evenly spaced on the landscape in a cookie-cutter pattern. The bears eat what are the highest quality foods in the forest, the nuts, berries, and ants, bees, and grubs. These foods are generally available in patches that are affected by seasonal changes and the weather, frost, and droughts. So at any given time, one female bear may have a huge surplus of food in her home range, and her neighbor could have nothing. And this has led to a system of sharing over time that I believe to parallel human behavior, that these female bears are reciprocal altruists. And that means that they trade favors over a period of time with a big time delay. So in 1 year, my bear Squirty, who controls an oak ridge, allows her neighbors to come into the oak ridge under the condition that in the following year there may be only beach, that she has access to her neighbor's beach. And along with this goes all the psychological conditions that were laid out by Robert Trivers in his paper in 1971 when he described social behavior of humans as reciprocal altruism. And that's what I'll be talking about tonight. The cubs that I used in my study were the very young cubs that came to me before they had experience outside their natural dens. These were the bottle feeders. They were dependent on me regardless of how I raised them. And I decided they could use an education. I took them for long walks in the forest, up to 9 hours at a time, and returned them safely to remote enclosures. I was able to observe their very first reactions to their natural environment. I could see their tongues coming out in a very exaggerated fashion and sticking to an object, lifting scent off that object, bringing it back to a small bump behind their front teeth. This bump is called the papilla of the vomeronasal organ. Bears, like your cats and dogs at home, have two olfactory systems. The vomeronasal system that learns, identifies new scent, and the nasal epithelium that learns from the vomeronasal system and is able to locate and later identify scent as well. These same behaviors in adult animals are very subtle and very hard to observe, but with these cubs, they were very exaggerated, and I learned the behavior associated with smell, something that other scientists didn't think was possible. I followed several of these bears into adulthood. One of them was a bear named Yoda, who lived for 5.5 years and raised one set of cubs. But the main bear that I work with is this bear. Her name is Squirty. I've written about Squirty in both of my books. She's been in all the films that National Geographic and Discovery have done on my work. Squirty came to me as a 3-pound cub, 6 or 7 weeks old. I raised her by walking her loose in the forest. When she became of age, I put a radio collar on her and followed her into the forest to see what she was up to. And now she comes to my study area. Squirty not only was successful in establishing her own home range, but as she expanded her home range, she dropped a daughter into the expanded area, and she developed what I call a greater home range. Now she enjoys quite a large home range that she shares with a number of adult daughters, granddaughters, and great-granddaughters. Squirty manages her family organization. It's a matrilinear hierarchy, and Squirty is the matriarch. This is her oldest daughter, SQ2, another adult granddaughter, SNLO, a younger daughter, Brooke, another adult granddaughter, 2, and the young subadult, SQ2LO, who's the daughter of SQ2. It's a matrilinear hierarchy because on sight she will chase all the bears below her in the hierarchy. It's linear because the number 2 bear chases all the bears below her. The number 3 bear chases all the bears below her. And everybody chases SQ2. The result of this is that in a marginal food year, Squirty will have access to the highest quality foods in the greater home range. And it ensures that at least one of these females will be able to reproduce, even if there isn't much natural food around. In a good food year, all the females that are ready to reproduce will reproduce. But the second thing it does, it gives a place for these subadult females to stay until the home range opens up for them. If there was an open home range, they'd give birth for the first time at age 3. But because they're being pushed, they might not give birth until they're age 4, 5, 6, or in one case even 7 years old. So the bears have a mechanism to manage their own population based on a natural food supply. But unfortunately, there's nothing natural about the bear's food supply. The amount of human foods that enter the bear's food chain is fairly large, with bird feeders, dumpsters, landfills, agricultural crops, corn, and even logging increases the number of female home ranges on the landscape. Logging increases the number of berries and ants, bees, and grubs, and improves the quality of female home ranges. The young males that came into my study area, all the subadult males, were quickly chased out. In this series of pictures, Squirty is going after her grandson. I watched this little guy get chased more than 30 times, not only by his grandmother, but by his mother, by his aunts, and any other bear that could get a target on him. And finally, by September of the second year, he left the greater home range and joined the population of male bears in the Upper Valley. This next video, this is SQ2LO as an adult, and she's chasing an adult male out of the study area. This is something that all the females cooperated in doing, was keeping males out of these female home ranges. Oops. The large males that came into my study area came in during the breeding season, and I'll take a moment to explain my study area. It's on a piece of property that Debbie and I own. It's a 400-acre piece of property. It's surrounded by about 65,000 contiguous acres. It's a mile from the nearest town road. I go up there every evening, unless it's an evening like this where I have to give a talk, and then my sister covers for me. I provide a small amount of corn to any bear that shows up. Some nights no bears show up, and some nights quite a few bears show up. My interest has been in social interactions between bears. I've documented more than 1,500 social interactions, and the result of that has been my thesis. I got my PhD from Drexel University 2 years ago, and it's on the social behavior of American black bear. Without this study site, I wouldn't have numbers. I've known what was going on for a long time, but observations aren't good enough in this world. Science likes numbers, and now I have lots of numbers. So the large males would hang around, and after the breeding season, it's only the largest 10% of the males that do all the mating, the 300-pound plus animals. And because of their size, they could take food from whoever they wanted. But it was only a matter of time before the females decided it was time for them to leave. And in this picture, Squirty, weighing about 180 pounds, is going after a 350-pound male, asking him to leave. I watched her daughter rescue two when she only weighed 150 pounds, do a very deliberate, zigzag, stiff-legged walk slowly back and forth in front of one of these big males. He backed off into the bushes and acted like it was no big deal. But in the morning he was gone and he never returned. This suggests that there's a degree of female choice in mating, because if there wasn't a repercussion, these large males would stay and compete with the females in the female home ranges. The big surprise in my study was that there was a number of unrelated females that Squirty gave access to not only the study site, which she controls. It's primarily her relatives that come in there. The rest that are unwelcome get asked to leave. That she allowed into her inner circle. They were all, again, unrelated females. They were all relatives of this bear, a bear we call Moose. Moose was 13 years Squirty's senior. And the year I released Squirty into the wild with her siblings was the year that Moose didn't have any cubs. And in the spring of the year, I noticed my cubs ran from me one time. I had the radio collar on one of them. Normally I could call them up, and I figured they were probably with another bear. And the next morning I decided to sneak in to see who they were with. I got the wind right. I went into a beach stand early in April, and I accidentally stepped on a large stick and broke it. And my two cubs panicked and ran and treed up a large tree, started moaning, and this bear came over and false charged me, defending my cubs from me. I went, whoa, what's going on here? And finally my scent reached my cubs. They recognized me, they came down, and they came up, and after greeting me, each one of them bit me on my forehead, punishing me for interrupting their time with their new friend. But ever since that time, Squirty has allowed Moose and all her female relatives access to her surplus resources. And interestingly enough, she shows very little aggression towards these strangers compared to what she does her family members. And here I recognized a huge parallel with human behavior. Because if you think about it, we're much harsher on our family members than we are on strangers. And the reason that we're harsh on family members is that they're our closest cooperators. It's terribly important that we communicate with them. Unfortunately, how we communicate is not always pretty. And we can get away with this because we can always reconcile with a family member. But you never go up to a stranger and rank them out the same way you might a family member. Because a stranger is also a cooperator, and you might not be able to reconcile with a stranger. And that stranger might be important in your survival sometime in the future. So this was a huge discovery, finding out this same behavior existed in the black bear. The male social behavior was much harder to study than the female. Male annual home ranges can be as much as 200 square miles. Some of them are very transient and travel a lot. The breeding males can stay in an area for 2 or 3 years. They might be somewhere completely different outside the breeding season. I tried telemetry collars early on and wasted a lot of time driving around locating signals and learning very little. I noticed there was an awful lot in some of the clear cuts in my study area. There was an awful lot of bear sign. And when trail cameras became available and affordable, I started monitoring the extra bears in my female home ranges using trail cameras. I would set up a trail camera with a gallon bag of corn scattered in front of it. When that was cleaned up, I would put another gallon in front of it. And it wasn't unusual to get 8 or 10 different males in a 2-week period. Now, I took a lot of pictures. I took 100,000 pictures or more before I made any sense about what was going on. But finally, in 2008, I set up in a clear cut that was about 16 years old, right at the end of its productivity. I got my 8 or 10 males. When I set up my cameras, only 2 cameras in 2009, the only bear there was the resident female. The males had all moved on to another area of surplus. And the big surprise was in 2008, I had an awful lot of pictures of 2 male bears sharing that small amount of corn. I knew the amount of corn that I was giving them, one bear could eat easily, and the sharing was taking place between unrelated individuals. I had to have the DNA done of the bears in my study area. I collected hair samples with hair snares, and the male bear population is genetically unrelated to each other. So I realized here that the males had formed a coalition of friends, and their strategy was to move in groups of 8 to 10 and overpower the females in order to access surplus food in the female home ranges. I already knew that if they came in by themselves, they were going to be escorted to the door. And a much smaller female could drive any size male out without any problem. But in groups of 8 or 10, they were able to overpower the females to access those surplus foods. Now, this isn't reciprocal altruism, it's mutualism, but it's mutualism between unrelated individuals, which is just as interesting as the reciprocal altruism. All of this is about the access to food, and in the spring of the year, the bears eat what I call emerging growth. They're feeding on succulent vegetation if there isn't any leftover nuts from the previous year. These cubs are climbing a red oak tree and feeding on the oak leaf starts as the buds first break into leaves. They're feeding on the edge of agricultural fields on succulent grass. They're feeding on nodding sedge and the woodland trails, the flowers of white ash and red maple. When they emerge from the dens in early April, they're eating the swollen buds of beech. By mid-May, the beech leaf starts, and beech leaves as late as the middle of June. So there's an abundance of food for bears at this time of year. None of it's going to make them fat, but the important thing about it is that there's very little social competition in order to access food. Wherever they go, food is available to them. And so they pick the spring of the year for their mating season. The female bears first come into estrus in the middle of May and continue to the first week of July, which coincides with the berry season. The male and female bears spend 3 to 7 days together, and the result of that union is a 2-celled organism called a blastocyst. They're delayed implanters, so the blastocyst doesn't implant into the uterus until late November, early December. Wow. Then there's a short gestation period of 50 to 55 days. The cubs are born in the dead of winter, mid-January. They weigh less than a pound. They're nearly hairless. Their eyes are shut. Their little ear flaps are down. They continue to develop in the mother's fur and are unable to walk or climb until she emerges from the den in early to mid-April. The first thing the mother bear will do is to build a nest at the bottom of a good climbing tree. Her cubs instinctively can climb, but they have to learn about rough bark, smooth bark, and the skinny end of a limb. She'll spend 3 to 4 weeks at this site until the cubs are adept at following and climbing before she moves on to better feeding grounds. When she does, she'll pick a spot with a good pine tree that's near water, something I call a babysitting tree. The cubs will continue to practice climbing and sleeping in the trees. The mother will radiate out from the bottom of the tree to forage and feed. The cub's toenails are audible on the bark, so if something gets after the cubs, she can return in a hurry to see what's going on. They'll continue to forage and feed in this fashion throughout the summer and fall, and the cubs will den with her as yearlings the following winter. Family unit will break up the following spring when the male bear shows up. Family breakup is rather abrupt. It will go from a tender scene like this, where Squirty's adopted daughter, Josie, is grooming ticks off her yearling son. She'll be like this one week, and the next week she becomes the tail of the Hun. This female bear chased her cub up the tree and out on a limb, and then she'd go all the way to the bottom of the tree, and then when her cub just thought about coming down, she'd go all the way back up the tree. I watched her go up this tree 9 times in 10 minutes before letting her cub alone. And she'll do this for weeks on end until the cub finally gets the message that it's over. Finally, the male bear shows up. This is Squirty's daughter, Rescue 2, with her mate showing up for the first time. You'll see that she's rather aggressive with him. She's been busy with her cubs for 18 months and doesn't know this big guy very well. Oh, that wasn't on?
No.
You can see the size difference between them. It's called sexual dimorphism. Females put their extra energy into reproduction, and the males put it into gaining size to mate. He's opening and closing his mouth, taking a little bit out. Finally, he catches up with her, grabs her with his forepaws and bites her behind the neck. All of this aggression and the bite behind the neck helps stimulate the female to ovulate precisely at the time of mating, which ensures that conception will take place. This first grasp only lasted a few minutes before they broke up and had another 20 minutes of pre-courtship behavior around the clearing. In my book, Out on a Limb, there's a picture section with lots of close-up pictures of the bears standing and open-mouth wrestling in the clearing. The next time they locked up, they literally locked up. The male bear has a baculum or penis bone that's hooked like a dog's that locks over the female pelvis. They were locked together for 45 minutes. During that time, there was another female bear in the clearing that walked by him 10 feet away, rubbernecking as to what was going on. Finally, they broke up and disappeared into the forest. 85% of the black bear's diet is vegetative, 10 to 15% is animal protein, and of the animal protein, 90 to 95% are ants, bees, and grubs. Insects are 54% protein. Things like chicken and beef are about 17 or 18% protein. I used to tell audiences that bears ate ants 10 or 15 times a day. I was out with Squirty one afternoon, and she'd run her nose along a log, smell a colony of ants, and bite into the log, and then lick up whatever larvae and ants that got in the way. She was finding and cleaning out ant colonies at the rate of 40 to 60 an hour. She was highly adept at this. I was with Yoda along the Mascoma River. It was a dry fall. There was an abundance of ground nesting hornets, yellow jackets in the forest. Yoda made her fall feeding strategy going after hornet's nests. She combed her home range, smelling hornet's nests from about 35 yards away. She was cleaning out nests at the rate of 12 to 16 an hour. She'd follow the scent to the nest. She'd bite into the nest. About 150 hornets would whack her in the face. She'd bat her muzzle and shake her head and go right in and clean out whatever larvae and hornets got in the way. She'd casually walk off with a swarm of hornets over her head like Pigpen in the Peanuts cartoon. In the meantime, her cubs would hit the deck because they couldn't handle the stings like their mother could. The summer vegetative foods of the black bear grow in moist-rich soils around rivers and streams and wetlands. There's three primary plant groups, jewelweed or touch-me-not that grows in everybody's yard in the spring, several species of wild lettuce, and the most important is jack-in-the-pulpit. Jack-in-the-pulpit is the most important because it has a root or a corm that's more nutritious than either beechnuts or acorns. It's also the reason, it's what brings bears and people close together. After all, we settled in the valleys for those same rich soils. It's not unusual in New Hampshire to have a nicely mowed lawn leading up to an old orchard with maybe 3 feet of vegetation. A black bear can be happily out there digging jack-in-the-pulpit root, and you never know it. You never know it unless you saw the stumbled trails and occasional divot with the white roots growing into it, where a bear dug a jack-in-the-pulpit root. You never know it unless the bear stuck its head up in the air and smelled black oil sunflower seed. Black oil sunflower seed has 3 times the calories per unit of any of their natural foods. And when none of those high-quality foods are available in the spring, it's about 10 times the value of vegetation. Bears prioritize their food by the quality of food, the quantity of food, and the amount of risk that it takes to get the food. The average black bear, the average person puts out sunflower seed at the rate of 5 to 25 pounds at a time. So a black bear can come into your yard and get a day's pay in about 15 minutes. If you want to, the average black bear needs to put on 30% of its body weight in fat just to survive the winter, to hibernate. A female black bear giving birth to cubs needs to put on 50% of her body weight in fat to give birth to cubs and have reserves for the early spring to get the cubs through that period. So if you want to understand why bears act the way they do around food, just think about how we act around money. After all, we store our money, we put it in a bank for a retirement, to put our kids through school, or to buy a fancy toy. And you wouldn't go home tonight and scatter $20 bills all over your lawn and have the expectation that nobody would pick any of them up. And that's the same expectation we have when we have a bird feeder on our deck and wonder why the bear's on our deck that close to our house. And so these food rewards are like having $100 bills or $200 bills for the bears to pick up. The natural foods that the bears use to put on the fat to reproduce and get through the winter in New Hampshire are red oak and beech nuts. The red oak is primarily in the central and southern parts of the state and up the Connecticut River Valley, and beech is in the rest of the state. Bears use a number of different types of dens in New Hampshire. In this picture, I'm crawling out of an excavated den that Yoda used both as a maternal den and a den with her yearlings. It was under a root mass of a tree that had gone over many years before. And when I crawled into the den and looked up, the ceiling of the den was a matrix of live roots that prevented the soils from collapsing down around Yoda and her cubs during winter time. This bear chose a different strategy. She had an open ground nest. This is out, exposed to the elements. It's about 3 feet in diameter, perfectly rounded on the bottom like a robin's nest. And she liked this slat. It's not warmth that the bears need or protection from the elements. They're the most vulnerable at this time to predators. And it's that slash around her that prevented her and gave her the safety for her cubs. And here she is in her open ground nest with her cubs. We also saw rock dens, and these are just in the pile of rocks below the ledges. These rock dens made our winter den work difficult. I have a cooperative project with New Hampshire Fish and Game where we try to keep GPS collars on 10 wild females. We change batteries in the winter. Fish and Game wants to know the number of cubs that are born and the number that survive as yearlings, as well as a lot of data on their health. I want to know behavior. These dens, the bear can get into a hole that's not much larger than its head. They can wiggle down into the rocks. Their shoulders are very supple. Their back is very flexible. And often we can see them in these dens. We might even be able to sedate them, but we can't get them out. And so it can be very difficult. We thought about designing the perfect UNH student that was skinny, flexible, and strong, and could lower down by bootstraps. But so far that hasn't worked very well. Here's a mother bear with her yearling in a rock den. And the last type of den I'll talk about are tree dens. This den was outside of a new residential area in Lyme, and one morning early in April, I got a call from a woman. She said there was a bear in a tree. And these trees, when they get to be about 3 feet in diameter, the center of the tree can rot and drop out, leaving a huge cavity. And I got there, and sure enough, there was a bear in the tree. And I informed her the bear had been in her tree all winter long. Bears have complex communication to go along with their complex social behavior. In this picture, Squirty is opening and closing her mouth, expelling moist air from her lungs, picking up scent on the airwaves, and drawing it back through her olfactory systems. One of the things I discovered about the bear was not only do they have a vomeronasal system, like other mammals, which typically lifts large molecules of scent using saliva, and offers it to that papilla I talked about. But they also have an accessory organ to it that allows them to identify light or volatile molecules. And I discovered this because all the new vegetation that the cubs encountered, the first set of cubs that encountered, they'd hold a leaf in their mouth just for a few seconds and then release it. I called it mouthing. I didn't know what it meant. And I had a couple of Brittany Spaniels at the time. I stuck leaves in their mouths and they weren't very happy. I put leaves in my own mouth and no bells and whistles went off. So I started learning all the different types of plants that the bears were sampling and documenting what ultimately happened to them. And over the course of the summer, they had identified 125 different food items and disregarded many, many more. And I determined that a bear could tell if a plant were edible or not simply by holding it in its mouth for a few seconds. And this lends credence to the fact that Native Americans observed the black bear to find out what plants could be used as foods or pharmaceuticals. Many of the plants out there are deadly and drop-dead deadly, so we don't want to go out and start looking for supper by sampling things. Then I did a necropsy of a roadkill bear. I found the organ to be in a pocket of the vomer, which is a V-shaped bone that lays under the nasal septum. There was a sensory nerve that came down to the roof of the palate, and then a bundle of sensory nerves that went up the vomer, under the brain, and spread out across the roof of the throat. So all the scent the bear took in through his nose or mouth passed over these sensory nerves. And I went to the museums and I looked at skulls of other mammals and didn't find this set up in any other mammal. And the bears all the other mammals that lacked it, all had long-range communication. All the bears' long-range communication is done with scent. A bear can tell by a puff of scent in the wind who that bear is that may be 15 minutes away. I've watched Squirty react emotionally, knowing it was a bear she didn't like or didn't trust. So she responded knowing the individual who was coming. Bears have emotional expression. Emotional expression is generally honest. This includes facial expressions, body language, intonation of voice. As humans, any social animal needs to have a means of communicating mood. As humans, we have we're the most highly evolved social system, and we have more facial expressions than any other mammal on Earth. We have over 3,000 muscles in our face devoted to expression. We wouldn't be able to meet in this room if we weren't comfortable with the emotional state of everybody else in this room. And that's written all over our faces. Right now, everybody in this room has a neutral look on their face, something I call subway face. You can see that anywhere you ride a subway in the world. But if somebody were up to something in this room, that would also be written all over his face. And we'd all know who he was, we'd all be uncomfortable, but we wouldn't know what he was up to. A few years ago, when the Boston bombings took place, they caught the perpetrators by reviewing videos. They were looking for somebody who looked different than everybody else. And there was these two guys walking away trying to look normal while everybody else was horrified. In this picture, Squirty has just put one of her cubs up a tree at weaning time. And you can see she has eye expression, eyebrow expression, general facial expression, and ear expression. When a bear's ears are pinned, like with a horse or a deer, means they're aggravated, and she has many ear positions in between. In this picture, she has a happy face. Now, I get told bear stories by lots of people, and I often ask them what the bear looked like. The answer I always get, it was black. Bears also have the expression of intention, and this is where I get in trouble with modern scientists. They don't attribute intention to non-human animals. If you think about our language is an emotional utterance with a mechanical manipulation of our lips, teeth, tongue, and larynx. So we can lie with our words, and we rely on emotional expression to determine if somebody's telling the truth or not. Well, bears also have the expression of intention, and I think the reason they have it, and we have it, is that we and they both communicate and cooperate with strangers. And strangers are much more difficult and dangerous to communicate with than family members. Let's face it, around our house we can grunt and groan and everybody knows what's going on, but you get out in the real world, you got to get it right or there might be ramifications. So when a bear is expressing intention, now he's mechanically generating sounds and actions. Now he's chomping his teeth, he's huffing, swatting, false charging, and making that guttural sound that the male was in the early video, that oh. The meaning of these sounds and actions is based on the context of the situation at the time. So even though they're limited in the number of ways they can communicate, it's greatly broadened by context. So if you meet a bear and he false charges you, pay attention to what's going on, and you can find out what's happening. As an example, you're walking up a trail, it's quiet walking, it's a smooth trail with no sticks or anything on it. There happens to be a mother bear there with her cubs. She's just out having a nice day with her cubs, and then you come along. She thinks you're going to attack her, so she false charges you. She lunges towards you, swats the ground, expels a big blast of air. Your bodily fluids run a little bit. She thinks she's going to eat you. But all she wants to do is delay confrontation long enough for communication to take place. Bears operate on our level of emotional communication. And again, that's facial expression, body language, intonation of voice, intensity of voice. 85% of how we communicate with each other every day is with emotional communication. Unfortunately, it's largely subconscious. Language is so powerful, it's only 15% of how we communicate. It's so powerful, we don't pay attention to our emotional communication. So bears can read us just fine. We think bears are from Mars. And that's why I spend as much time as I do on bear communication in my books and videos and in my lectures. So if you're in another situation, you're working at a restaurant and you're carrying a pail of food scraps out to the dumpster, and a bear false charges you, he simply wants you to drop the pail of food scraps before you put it in the dumpster. I was with Squirty one afternoon. It was a beautiful sunny day, and in Lambert Ridge and Lime, and this thunderhead came rumbling up the valley. Squirty false charged the thunderhead. And believe it or not, the thunderhead turned and left in the sunshine. Now I'm going to show you a video of Squirty false charging. It's a fairly intense false charge. The context is the last film that National Geographic did on my work, A Man Among Bears. The film crew showed up and they thought they were going to film Squirty for 8 hours. Squirty showed up and thought 40 minutes was more than enough. This is Squirty telling the film crew to pack your bag and go home. She went from a relaxed state, she thought about it, her base got long, she delivered her blow, and then she went back to a relaxed state. I filmed that, I was 10 feet from her with a handheld camera. Now I've been false charged lots of times. They come in all kinds of intensities. I've had biologists looking at my film and I say to Squirty, all right, Squirty, I'm going. You gotta remember, if I spend time with her, I'm taking her time. So I only have so much time. And I said, all right, Squirty, I'm leaving. And he said, what'd you see? What'd you see? Because she hadn't done anything. Well, her eyes twitched. And when a bear's eyes twitch side to side, they're thinking about doing something. And I pick up on that, and I said, all right, I'm going to go. If I didn't go, then the next thing would be a mild false charge. If I didn't go then she'd ratchet it up until she got my attention. But generally, I pick up on the early clues and leave without stirring them up. This next clip is Squirty's great-granddaughter. She has cubs. Wanda, she just likes to false charge. She false charges all the time for any reason. And she false charges, and you'll see it's much less intense than Squirty's. And then she walks right over to me. This next clip I used in my thesis, and because I spoke about intention, and I said it's something that's controversial, but female bears manage their cubs with two vocalizations in body language. They use the gulp, which is gulp, and a chirp, which is and then that in syntax with body language. So if she wants her cubs to tree, she moves towards the tree. She expects her cubs to follow and tree, and she'll be gulping the whole way. She wants her cubs to come down, she'll sit at the base of the tree, look up and gulp, and the cubs will come down. She wants to lead them away, she'll gulp and walk away, and she expects them to follow. Now the unfortunate thing is, they're not born with the knowledge of the meaning of these vocalizations. She has to teach them the meanings of these vocalizations, and that's where intention comes in, where she's able to know whether they know something or not. And in this clip, her cubs are feeding. She senses danger. She knows that another bear is coming, and she's trying to get their attention, so they'll either follow her away or climb the tree, and they're, for the most part, oblivious. She starts to gulp, indicating the danger. Chirp. And they're oblivious. Non-responsive. She tugs at one of them. She walks away gulping. That's the syntax. She expects them to follow. They're oblivious. She comes back. She's getting more intense with her vocalizations. They're still oblivious. One of them's beginning to catch on. She gives it a nudge. Begins to demonstrate what she wants. The other one's still oblivious. She's trying to push it up the tree. She knows there's danger in the area. She's getting more intense with her vocalizations. They still don't have a clue. Again, more intensity. They're still oblivious. Finally, they go, they reinforce it. Now she's chomping, and there's another bear underneath